We'll now have a panel discussion on responsible AI for India, again moderated by Professor Ravindran, head of CRI. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the panel members and also invite them to the podium. Firstly, we are pleased to have Professor Partha Talukdar, Senior Research Scientist at Google Research Bangalore and an Associate Professor at IIT Bangalore. He has 18 plus years of research experience in NLP, ML, and knowledge graphs. His recent research has focused on multilingual learning, learning in low-resource settings, graph-based learning, automatic knowledge harvesting and for web-scale data sets, and temporal information processing. We welcome you to the panel. We are pleased to have Mr. Ankit Bose, Head of NASSCOM AI and the CEO of Center of Excellence of Data Science and AI, Telangana AI Mission, Responsible AI Hub. We welcome you to the panel. We are pleased to have Professor Sudarshan Padmanaban, Professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. His research interests are in social and political systems, civil society, and recently AI and ethics in the Indian context. We welcome you to the panel. We are happy to have Mr. Koteeswaran, who is a Deep Tech Chair, TIE Chennai, and the Startup Chair at SICI, Southern Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He's also an 1989 to 93 alum of IIT Madras. We welcome you to the panel. And finally, we would also welcome Professor Ravindran to moderate the panel discussion.
So, hello everyone again. So the topic for this panel discussion is about responsible AI challenges for India, and so I'll like to start by asking the panelists to give their opening thoughts on what do they see as the biggest challenges for building responsible AI systems in India. So Partha, you want to go first?
Thanks, Ravi, for having me here, for this inaugural workshop. So yeah, I guess AI is not just a scientific pursuit alone, right? I mean, as we have already know that AI is for real. There are deployed systems, and it's I guess only going to accelerate. And the output that's coming from the systems is going to have material impact on people's lives. So doing this well is really important, right? Because this is not just a exploratory thing anymore. And so in order to do this well, I mean we always think in terms of say in machine learning. We have some data sets and we focus on building the model and the algorithm that say optimizes some metric. And so when it's getting deployed in the real world, there is both doing well for that segment that the data covers. We have challenges in doing that alone, right? So things about say explainability, the target audience that your data is likely to support well, how we can serve that population well. I mean, there are challenges just in that one itself, in terms of explainability, building trust, many of the topics that we mentioned, right? But what doesn't get maybe as much covered is the, and there is a a gradation there in terms of how well we are able to serve that. But then there is vast amounts of the society that's not covered by those data sets, right? And so that inclusion aspect is, I think, super important. And so when we build these AI systems, most of the people who are building those are like a homogeneous group, right? Not very well representative of society. The data sets that we are building those things on are also only partially reflective. So if we are not very cognizant, then we'll be just catering to a small part of the society and just making a rich gets richer kind of a phenomenon, right? So we'll be leaving out a large portion of the population that we could potentially serve and have traditionally underrepresented. And I see that, if you're not very conscious, that gap is going to increase exponentially, right? And then people will be forced to make choices or denied opportunities and access to information, which will be really unfortunate. And so I think paying attention to responsible AI is really important, so that we do well for the people that that are covered by the data, but also the larger segment of the society. And I think we should be working towards shrinking that gap that's there, rather than amplifying that. And I feel that without conscious effort, that's not going to happen. And that's where responsible AI is really important. And as was also covered in Sachi's talk, most of the work has happened from an Western lens, right? And given the context that we are in, additional kind of nuances and adaptations, we should definitely learn from that, but we should also extend and apply in our setting. And that's really important, and I'm hoping that the center is going to play a really crucial role in that. And so this is, I think, super timely and extremely important in the Indian context.
So I completely agree with Partha. Now, if you see currently what's happening, right? So generative AI is here, right? So AGI, new technologies around AI are coming, and they are not just one binary on that topic. They are dimension specific. They are basically sector specific, right? So it's cutting across every sector which we humans deal with, right? Now, what's happening with that? There's a lot of anxiety, fear, right? And at the same time, people are excited, right? So right now, what I see, there's a huge need to build trust, right? So though there's adoption, but adoption has to be supported by trust, and initiatives like this, right? And what we have with NITI, with MIT, with NASSCOM, all of this are really good efforts to build that trust, right? Now, what do we have on responsible AI? As Partha was saying and Sachi was saying, most of the work which has been done is from the global north. So that mostly, if you see GPA, right? GPA has at least 80% members from the European Union or US or the developed countries. India and China are the two only developing countries. Now, if you see the research work, what's happening around this topic is very little, and applied is even far little, right? So I think we need more work from the standpoint of Indian context and global South context. That's what is needed. So that's the first thing. Second, I see a phenomenal opportunity to India to fill in that shoes and do real work around building AI systems which are trustworthy, right? I think that's what I feel, Doctor.
Thank you. I'll start with the general and I'll go to the particular. I'll start with the challenges, which is cultural. Then I'll go to something that is behavioral. Then I'll go to the last one, which is individual. So cultural, already explained by both Ankit and Partha about how we have to translate whatever is done in the global north, then adapt it to the south. That is the broadest aspect. Culturally, we all know India is an extremely diverse country, and probably mind-boggling diversity, social, political, economic, cultural, religious, linguistic, whatever. That is the major issue, challenge. The second one is about behavioral, because earlier if you look at technology, technology was something that was objective, right? So when we teach courses here, we always talk about ethics is subjective. People don't, actually generally students don't understand what it means when you say subjective and objective. In the case of ethics being subjective, I as the subject decide what is right and what is wrong. So that is what subjective means. Subjective means it's not arbitrary, it is not opinion, it is not something that is just anything goes kind of thing, right? So you need to, when ethics is about action and consequences and motivations, right? You have to justify all these three. So there is a kind of continuum, there is a process in ethics. So you have to justify what is your motivation, what is your projection or an understanding of the consequences of your action. So ethics is always about action. So ethics is not static, ethics is not, something that is inactive. So ethics is always about action. So the term ethos, term moral, term dharma, these are all captured because there is a foundation on which ethics is built. So the behavioral side becomes extremely important because the AI is no more an objective technology. So the scientific cultural paradigm itself is changed. Technology paradigm has changed. That means technology is now with us in the watch, in cell phone. It anticipates us, it guides us, it kind of tells us don't do this, don't do that. So it has, ironically, technology has become subjective because it's like a shadow, or probably we are the shadow of the technology, AI technology. So that is how the paradigm shift has happened. So understanding the paradigm itself is going to be a major challenge for most of the people. So as Partha was saying, most people are going to be left out, have been left out because of digital divide. Even in the US, if you look at the COVID statistics, the lower levels of the society, hardly 33% had access to internet, whereas at the highest level, 96-97%. So that is the level of digital divide. With AI divide that comes in, there's going to be like just explosion of, what do you call, deprivation. So deprivation in terms of information, as Partha rightly pointed out. So the third, so behavioral aspect is also the way you address the AI and how you consume the AI, understanding, information, communication, and also dissemination of the information. This has been completely changed. So the technological paradigm, scientific paradigm, how you understand as the language, we see what Shachi was explaining. It was really scary. What we used to teach in logic, what is stereotype? We used to say that, okay, if you kind of make a false generalization, it is more of a stereotype. But now, if you look at it, it is going to be like mind-boggling the amount of work that's going to go into just this stereotype in one particular community or religion or within a culture. So the amount of work that's going to happen is humongous. So that is the behavioral aspect, behavioral change. Third one is the agential perspective. Agential means agency as an individual. What is the agency? That is going to come under tremendous stress because of AI. So how are you going to justify your actions? Privacy. Some people talk about information, for example, informed consent. Ravi was talking about informed consent. There is no concept of informed consent in India. Okay, there are only 1 or 2 papers written by somebody in terms of informed consent. So even without AI, we have a lot of problems in terms of privacy, in terms of accountability, transparency. So how are we going to, suddenly there is a huge, we are from ground earth, we are going to Mars. So how are you going to address this issue? That is a major, major challenge I see. So I see cultural, I see behavioral, and also in terms of individual perspective, the paradigms have shifted completely, changed completely. These are the challenges we face. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's fascinating. So I'm probably going to approach this from, I'm excited to be here because both as a representative of SICI, the Southern India Chamber of Commerce, where we have a lot of members who should be doing a lot more AI in their traditional businesses, and also as a representative of TIE Chennai, which is supporting a lot of startups where everyone's trying the AI is a core part of all these startups that are coming up now. And so these challenges that were laid out here should not slow down our industry, right? Should not slow down either the established businesses that should be adopting AI or the early stage companies that are coming up. So that I see as the biggest challenge. So when I see the founders, when I see the captains of industry, I think they've recognized there is a big challenge in terms of responsible AI. And I see more and more of them coming up with ethical principles. So here are the few principles that our organization is going to follow. Or here are the few principles that we're going to go. And these are things that are set by the global standards, and they're picking it up. But when I have deeper conversations with people, that's kind of where it stops, unfortunately, right? So you put down these principles. Here are my 4 or 5 principles of my organizational. But unfortunately, the level of knowledge of ML, as well as how it's getting implemented, is not so strong that how do you apply these principles in your organization? That's the question. And the other thing that you pointed out is, there are these technology nerds who start these companies, right? So, I'm saying it in a positive way. Oblivious to some of the social aspects of life. So I think it's fairly important to have interdisciplinary teams and acknowledge that I'm very good at whatever. I mean, if I'm really good at mathematics or some data, but acknowledge it, but also recognize that I'm not able to see, I'm blind to a few things that are happening here. Let me have interdisciplinary teams that will bring those expertise in and have an open mind towards learning about it. So I think what I am excited about today is having a center like this here in IIT, I think would help a great deal the industry in this place, and because none of these problems are solved. When I hear professor talking about the challenges, I'm really worried about the industry folks who are going to run away at full speed saying, there's so many problems, let me stay away from it. No, we need to be at the cutting edge. We need to balance out. If we cannot explain everything what the model does, we should have the guardrails that will make sure that it's not going completely off the rails, right? So we're putting things in place. It's fabulous to have this center here to start with, and also I think we should make sure we are conducting awareness programs, making sure we are interacting with industry, and that these challenges do not slow the entrepreneurial spirit of our people, and that we need to make sure that we acknowledge the challenges, but we work together to help industry adopt AI in a strong way. I think people like Google are doing really well, and some of the NASSCOM members are doing exceptionally well. But we need to carry more industry members with us as we move forward, and that's something that as the center gets built up, we would be both as Sikhi and as Tai, and also as a past alumni member. I would love to make sure that more people get access to this center, and the research work that we're doing here is quickly translated to something that the layman can understand, and they really get to see how we are making progress in this, and not, some of the negative things that happen because of the founders of some of these big new technologies themselves scare the people and make them run away. If we have to make sure that we balance it out and we get the benefits of AI and people don't get scared too much. And while getting the benefits of AI, we're making sure that it's used the right way and it is being fair and so on. But we need to help the industry to make sure they're better equipped to deal with AI. So for that, I'm very excited. Thank you.
Thank you very much for their opening remarks. And so we completely understand that it has to be interdisciplinary, right? So in fact, half the things that Sudarshan says, it's still new to me, even though we have been working together for almost 2 years now. So more than that, yeah, almost 4 years now. Pre-COVID, yeah, we started pre-COVID. Yeah. And you will see that some of our partners will speak after the panel, right? You will see that they're bringing a very, very different perspective to the problem as well. So that's something we're very conscious about. So let me start off with a question that some of the press people asked us outside. So let's So how much has AI really penetrated into India that we need to talk about responsible AI here, right? So that was a question that one of the reporters asked. I mean, I gave a hand-wavy answer. Let's see what the panel thinks. So you want to go first, Kopi?
I think we are at a very nascent stage, right? So if I take healthcare, for instance, I'm seeing companies in India that are coming up with diagnostic tools. But if I look at the number of FDA approvals Indian companies are getting, Israel companies are getting a lot. So on a regular basis, there are new diagnostics approval from the FDA, from the Israeli companies. But India is just getting there. I know there's a company called Niramai, which I know they got an FDA approval a year or year and a half ago. And so there are a few that we are doing. And even in clinical decision systems, we are making progress, but it's at the early stage, and we should be doing a lot more in creating care pathways and so on. But the exciting part is, if I look at the entire healthcare data that we look at globally, it's only when we have a problem, like, I exist for God knows how long, 50 plus years, and then I have a problem and suddenly I do all the tests on myself, and then I make all analysis and diagnosis about me out of that small. So if you have this entire number of years curve and no data about me exists, and suddenly there's huge data about me, and then I make all decisions based on that small slice of data, right? And then, so his life might have been so different that that you need to have this perspective for making these decisions for healthcare. So as the whole world is moving from treating patients to healthcare outcomes, all this data are going to be more relevant. So it is getting captured. Right now, the healthcare professionals are not looking at it, but over the next 5 to 10 years, we are just looking at the tip of the iceberg and making all the decisions. We're going to look at everything. So the whole world, when related to healthcare outcomes, is at a very, very early stage, and which means a place like India, if everyone's at the starting point, then you can run faster, quicker, and also be in the race in some form as this data creeps in. So I see it as in India we're at a nascent stage, but even globally in most cases, since we're not looking at everything and we're just looking at small slices, globally also we are at a nascent stage. So the opportunity is huge. Why talking about responsible AI today is important is because you need to run at full speed to capture this. So if I'm taking 2 steps and somebody slaps me on the wrist saying you've done 5 things wrong, I don't even know today whether I've done those 5 things wrong, or only one of those things are wrong, but some of the other organizations are better equipped to respond to this. Today, because we are at a nascent stage, I don't know how to respond to it. I might just back off. But and some of it might be true, and some of it might just be rhetoric that comes to you. So we need to equip our companies and organizations to deal with this. So it is at a nascent stage, but we need the responsible AI at the nascent stage so that we can run at full speed and be one of the, like if we have enough of healthcare innovations coming from India, at least matching or 80 to 90% of what comes from Israel in a 5-year time frame, that would be fantastic. But we should be able to run at full speed to happen. So that's why I feel it's at a nascent stage, but responsible AI is important today so that we don't slow down and we can develop the industry really fast.
Ankit, you want to add something?
Yeah. So let me give you a perspective. I agree it's at a nascent stage. Let me give a perspective on market, right? So by 2027, it's said that Indian AI market will be 71 billion, right? And it's growing phenomenally high, right? But again, understanding India is such a big, country, such multifaceted. So it's still tiny, right? Now, the other point, probably other data point what I want to give is, we did a AI adoption index in India, right? And 0 to 4 scale, India was at around 2.45, okay? And you will be amazed to hear, automation and industrial, automotive industrial, they were at 2.56, I think, right? Followed by CPG, that was 2.52. Followed by banking, which was, I think, 2.4 something, 48. And followed by healthcare, that is 2.37, right? So I think the manufacturing or the automotive industrial is leading the way, right? And I think this all happened during the pandemic and various factors, right? But again, I think that's the second data point. Third data point is, if you see in India, we did recently a survey, right? Any company beyond 100 people are trying to probably adopt AI or some system some other way, right? They are thinking of that, right? Though they have not adopted, but they are thinking, right? So what these 3 things mean? The adoption is nascent, but it's going at a very fast pace, okay? And what are the hindrances? There are 3 hindrances or 4 hindrances I will probably pick, right? First is definitely important is trust, right? As we all know, right? So trust is the biggest hindrance. So people are not ready still to trust the systems what have been deployed. Are they, can they give them the right output, right? Will they not take away their job, right? All this, right? So these are first issue is that. Second is data, right? Again, there's hardly, so we talk about India data, definitely in the enterprise, probably context, the data is not available in enterprise also. There are so many different islands of data, which is not unified. Again, third is, still data science and ML and AI is still with selected few who basically can run like a science project. So the ROI of those projects are still not out yet, right? And how it can be really made understood to the end user, that's not known. I think Dr. covered that. Dr. Ravi covered that in one of the goals, right? How can they make AI more understood, right? So that's very important. So the accuracy, precision, recall, these are all technical terms. How insurer or probably underwriter will take that. He will not understand that, right? So he will say, I will go by my historical knowledge. That's what I will go with, right? And I think fourth is definitely to catalyze this, we need some sort of momentum from government also in terms of catalyzing it with some sort of guidelines, right, around how to use it, right? Because trust being the biggest issue. Now, if there are some guidelines there, I think that will help really everyone to follow that and at least adhere to that, right? So these are the points what I want to say.
So, you want to add anything or? Okay, fine. So we already touched upon it in the opening statement a little bit, but so one of the things I just want you to amplify a point that I have been making is that we need to do this research in India, in the Indian context, right? So what aspects of all of this responsible AI research you think would have a very different dimension in the Indian context? So Partha, first to you, then I'll, Professor Sudarshan, I would like you to answer.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, so like, in the, coming up with this kind of responsible AI or recontextually, at least the fairness aspects of it from the Indian context. So we had a paper at AACL which kind of tried to lay out the research agenda there. So so technology, society, and the values and the norms, right? So we need to kind of look at it from the local perspective. Okay. So I think kind of coming up with what are the norms and the values and some kind of principles, maybe at a society or country level, will be, I think, a first and important space.
Just to ask you to amplify on this, in
Yeah.
what way you think an India-specific policy would differ from, say, EU-specific policy?
Right. So even if you look at certain aspects so things that we are sensitive towards is not uniform across the societies, right? For example, say abortion, right? So could be kind of a very sensitive topic in certain parts of the world that may also be sensitive here, but it could just take some different forms and different manifestations. We may have some shared axis of discrimination or dimensions which could have these different manifestations, but in the Indian context we are going to have additional ones that are not covered there, right? So now if you look at that, say for example, so caste is an often kind of cited example of that, right? So whether those kind of existing ways of dealing with that, right, is sufficient and we are just creating a new instantiation along a new dimension, or whether any type of adaptations that are necessary which are consistent with the local values and the norms that we have as a society, I think that needs to be looked at, right? So one is kind of adaptation and the other one is extension along newer dimensions. So that's one. I forgot your original question. India specific,
India
right?
specific,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah. So I think one is around this setting up of these principles, right? Second one is, and this need not be just an India specific, but how we are going to enforce and monitor this, right? So both at kind of all the regulatory aspects will kind of get covered there at the country level and then within respective organizations. Educating and awareness, I think, is going to be important. But I think one of the very concrete things that needs to be done that's India specific is creation of data sets, right? So both for evaluations, because if you're not able to measure what we are trying to improve on, that'll be very hard to do. And so creation of those data resources for maybe starting off for evaluation of these responsible AI dimensions, and then finally also how we can develop mitigation strategies that's kind of is going to improve along those kind of identified dimensions of evaluations, right? So that's one. And then, I mean, we are going to have additional problems in terms of like, the resource constraint that's being there. If you want to like, extend along, like say, language as a dimension, you want to increase like an inclusion there. So we are going to have challenges there in terms of like, data being not there, quality not being good enough, which would be quite specific to, and could be quite different from like say the first world countries or the Western countries, where these problems may not be as much acute, but that's kind of like front end central for us if you want to develop inclusive technologies.
So I think it's pretty much covered what I'm supposed to say, but anyway, I'll also hazard some thoughts. I see major challenges, or especially India-specific challenges in dispute redressal. One is within the AI, one is as a consequence of AI. Actually, Lakshmi Narayan was here. We were discussing the other day, Chandrasekhar, about low-hanging fruits in law. For example, you have millions and millions of cases that are not decided because the courts are not able to handle it. So is there a redressal forum that can use AI very effectively? And I think the Chief Justice himself has reiterated several times that AI is going to be extremely important. And since my wife is also a lawyer and talked to many lawyers, they are very happy about ChatGPT because they don't have to spend time with the paralegals and others in drafting. Drafting is actually one of the most important.
But do they know that ChatGPT can refer to them non-existent cases?
I don't know. Really, I think they have to be very careful in how they use it. So I'm not an advocate of ChatGPT or something, because I was preparing for this panel yesterday. I read there is some Gita GPT and Hadith GPT, and it became such a controversial thing that they have stopped the Hadith GPT, and Gita GPT is coming at a lot of fire. So it has its own. I think you mentioned it outside the sample set. What happens? We have no idea. So sometimes it gives a Mickey Mouse version of Gita, Mickey Mouse version of Quran. So we have no understanding of what they talk about. So these are some of the challenges, especially coming back to dispute resolution. We need to have a mediation process because litigation is extremely prohibitively expensive. And see, as I mentioned to you earlier, the technology is, you cannot say it's going to be outside. It's going to be inside with us. So that means it's going to be part of our behavior, understanding, everything. So in that context, how are you going to avoid this prohibitive cost of litigation, arbitration? Even arbitration is much better, but it's still very expensive. So for ordinary people, the companies, all the stakeholders involved, how is the conflict resolution process going to happen? That is actually the major issue. And in the case of courts, that is actually why they are struggling, right? If Gandhi was a very big proponent of mediation. So even in his South Africa days, he was always about, if you want to provide justice, that means you have to solve the issue, fairly. That was his approach. It's not about winning the case, but it's about solving the problem, solving the issue. That's what he thought the duty of justice is. So in that sense, I would pick up from Gandhi and the mediation techniques that you use to kind of resolve the conflicts, both inside. In the case of algorithm, how do you resolve conflicts within the process? That is one area I'm interested in. Another one is how do you resolve the problems outside? Once you do this, then the cost of AI, both figuratively as well as literally, becomes less damaging for the society, as for the businesses, as for the consumers, everybody, law, everybody. So this is what I think is going to be a major challenge. I think very few people have thought about it. See, the GDPR starts with human rights. The first line is about human rights. So there is a universal principle which is acceptable to almost all the countries. But then, as Partha was mentioning, the specifics, especially in the case of US, it is called an litigious society. That means for everything, somebody pours a coffee, then there is everybody knows that coffee is hot, right? So somebody pours a coffee in Starbucks and there is a lawsuit against the Starbucks worker. So these kinds of litigious, you also become litigious society, then there is no end to it. So that means how are we going to, at a human level, resolve these issues? That is what the worry is. And some adversarial politics. In the case of US, the system is adversarial, extremely adversarial. So we have to probably think of a system. Ours is also adversarial, but we have to ensure that there is more parliamentary approach to in terms of communication, consensus building. So that means we have to think completely differently, not the way we have been thinking till now. So we have borrowed everything from outside. But I think we have to root it in the Indian. See, it doesn't have to be like anti-global, because human rights is human rights, whether it is in Africa or in India. So it doesn't have to be anti-global. But how do you explain it to the people on the ground that we are working on such principles, as Sir mentioned, on principles? If people don't understand the principles, then they will not trust you. So that is where my, I think my interest lies. So in the confluence of law, society, politics. So that's my interest.
So there is one example somebody was telling me some time back, right? So it turns out that in the US healthcare system, the quality of data that you have about African Americans, medical data, is actually very poor compared to the whites. Not because of anything else, because they are just discharged too quickly from the medical system. So they don't get enough data about them. So there are all these kinds of systemic biases in the system itself in terms of gathering data. I'm pretty sure that exists in India. I mean, we can't pat ourselves on the back saying we are virtuous. We just don't know. And in India, we don't record these. Right, these kind of systemic biases that exist. And one of the things that we should probably do is even discover those systemic biases. This is going back to the data quality thing that we're talking about, right? I think that's it. So I'll ask one more question from the press corps, right? And this is open to all of you. So, is it right to regulate technology? Right, so this is a question that people have asked, right? So can you regulate technology? Will you be stifling innovation? And what is the stand on it? Is this the right time to do it, or should we wait for applications to come and things like that? I think so. Ravi already had a great article on it some time back. So yeah, but I'd like your panel's opinion on this. It's open to all of you. Anyone who check it out. Okay, Ankit,
question
yeah.
is it
I mean, what is your thoughts on regulating technology, especially AI, at this point in time? Is it AI sufficiently mature that it can withstand regulation, or we should regulate it before it becomes sufficiently mature?
So, so probably I will give my take, right? So AI is definitely cutting across multiple domains, as we know, right? What will you regulate? You will regulate AI for healthcare, AI for manufacturing, or probably policing. You have to think on that, right? So you cannot just regulate AI that we regulate AI, everything will stop. That's the first point, right? So it's very hard to regulate just AI. Now the other point is, what can we do? We can basically work on a way where we have self-regulation embedded in the whole building of process of AI, right? Right. So that's what, so something, a term called meta policy making is something there, right? So what we do there is, you have between government and the industry, you define the whole, array, low, medium, high, right? Risk of use cases, right? For, and government defines the outcome of it, right? What the outcome they want. For low and medium, the industry can come out with their own, sort of guardrails, guidelines, standards, and voluntary reporting, right? And come back and say that this is what you do. And then for the high risky ones, government can have more strict norms which can be defined, right? That's one approach. Right? But again, if we regulate just AI at this moment, for a country like India, right? We are based on innovation. So we are just innovating now, right? Or we have been innovating, but again, we are right now doing it massively. We will stop the innovation. The massive adoption of AI will stop, which will hamper us in the long run. So you can control this, through self-induced regulation. I will suggest that, because if you just regulate it, you can regulate for the good actors, whatever the bad actors, right? So these are my point of views.
Yeah. So I guess, rather than all of the technology, thinking in terms of applications is probably the right thing to do, because it's the application that kind of matters at the end of the day, that affects the users, right? And not all applications are equally critical, right? And there are kind of gradations of those, and you should probably start with the ones that whatever priority order that we come up with. So that's one part, and then So yeah, so like, the thinking in terms of applications is one. And then I feel that this is not like, regulation is not banning, right? And I don't think that's kind of like a binary state that like, okay, either you have regulation or don't have regulation, right? And most of the times it's not like 0 to 1. So this is going to be an iterative process, right? And it's not going to be like, oh, like, we have like a foolproof regulation and we are going to like, wait until that's there in place, right? So it's going to be an iterative process. Like, some regulations will be there. Like, you deploy that, get some feedback and like, improve on top of that as you go along, right? So but at the very least, I think like, some kind of like, okay, you have some model, we have like, some maybe benchmarks and metrics that kind of like, that's more evaluated through some independent body in a fair way. And then you have like, benchmarks against that and you try to kind of like, hit some metrics on that, right? But what those metrics are, what those data sets are, we have to like, collectively decide on those.
Yeah, so we are very far away from that, right? I mean, Ankit talked about classifying things in various orders of priority. You are talking about a fair body for doing licensing and all that, right? So how far away are we from those? Years, months, decades?
I can jump on that. So if AI is going to decide the next song I'm going to listen to, I don't want any regulation on that, right? But if I'm going to recruit an employee, right? Let's say I'm just to be non-controversial, I'm recruiting an employee in Europe, and it's looking at the data of my organization of what I've recruited in the past and making that decision. That could be super controversial because there might be, or I'm being rejected a loan because of my PIN code, right? So these are places where I think we should have this conversation fairly quickly, and it cannot be that because when the conversation comes up, it's going to be very strong. So we need to, the self-regulation that you're talking about, the company should be smart enough to figure out this is really hard. You don't want to go and touch this and put an algorithm there. You want to make sure that you discuss with people, which is why I think a body like the Center for Responsible AI here would be useful, because these organizations can have this conversation, and there will be some things that are discussed with greater vigor. So the government might be in a different point of view, the industry body might be in a different point of view, and the organization might have a completely different point of view. So, but those should be handful in instances and would probably set the tone for how the rest should be looked at. And those will happen. Today it looks like it's going to happen, 2 years. Your question was framed that way. Is it going to happen 2 years? This can happen tomorrow, or if the press decides, it might have happened right now, as you're at it, saying that if I take 2 examples and show how it's been extremely unjust to me because of some algorithm you used it's current news. And for whatever reason, if a big organization is involved, then it's bigger news, right? If somebody can prove that, IIT Madras and Google have wronged and in the presence of NASSCOM, then that's big news. I mean, you will have to figure out some way of responding to it. So I think we have to be better prepared in educating our people, the industry, and everybody to deal with it. And when a national body is saying, can you self-regulate, then we have to be extremely disciplined in making sure we are recording it rightly and putting it in, because if you have 10 cases brought to you, then you're not left with any choice but you come back and regulate it. And that's too late, and in which case you're going to be superimposing. Nobody wants that. We want to make sure that we are all behaving in a responsible manner. And when I'm not aware what responsible is, then I want to at least have a discussion with the right people to understand what is allowed, what's not allowed, what should I be looking for. And that's where I think this center would be useful, because like the ethical principles, everyone's very clear. 5 points, beautiful. But you come to them and say, can I use this algorithm? And then you look at this, the principles are somewhere and this is somewhere. And we're just not able to connect it. So that's where we need help. And I think if it's causing a lot of damage, then we have to be looking at it very carefully. There will be anything to do with defense and things of national interest, then I think it should be regulated. But beyond that, if it's the music I'm listening to or the next movie I'm going to watch that the AI is coming up with, I think that's something we can figure out without AI. Or I don't think the heavy hitters need to come there. But even in that, if I'm being thrown articles which are of a particular thing over a period of time that can influence my mind, then that's something that somebody needs to step in. So these are, I think, super gray, and we would need a huge intellectual power to help people make these decisions. I mean, it's not easy. I might think I'm making, I have a particular point of view, but if I see what I've read over the past 6 months or whatever, 2 years, and if my informed decision is based on all of this, and someone's giving this to me in a beautiful, nice way, then you're probably influencing me in a very, very subtle, strong way. I mean, as a industry body, you would say, what is advertising? But when you show an ad, I know what an ad is, right? But this is a bit more subtle, subconscious. So that's a broader question for society. And 3 or 5 years down the line, I would expect humanities being a lot more involved in any of these technological conversations. Even today they're involved, but I'm saying I would see that a lot more involved. And even if I compare India with the West, most of the leaders in corporate world in the West do have humanities background. I see a lot more humanities background and I see a lot more technology background in India. It's also different phases of growth, but I do see it as being interdisciplinary, understanding multiple points of views would be very, very critical. And the conversation is going to happen way quicker than we think it's going to happen, is what I would respond with.
If I may add, I think nothing in terms of technology, but when I was reading about GDPR regulations and the US regulations, I think 2 different extremes actually. GDPR is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They are even proudly claim that their fines are very heavy, they are very stringent, all these things, and they are big on this right to forget, right to remove, or all those things. And the US is like very business friendly, and with all the things that happened with Trump and in the last 6, 7 years, I remember a delegation from the US came to IIT Madras, and they were very unhappy with India banning TikTok or something. Then I think they are banning or banned TikTok already. So it's we don't know how things are going to really pan out. And anyway, I don't know what TikTok is, to be honest. I'm absolutely ancient in this case. So, but I only realized that they were very unhappy. Their face was grim. India's basically cracking down on this regulation, all those things. So it can just happen a jiffy. But I think somewhere in the middle is what we should look at. We should also encourage innovation, but then on the other hand, especially with respect to public responsibilities of the companies, and I just read somewhere the statistics that people are talking about responsible AI, and 100% of the companies said yes, 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 and finally only 25% of them actually implemented. So that means that self-regulation also has its own pitfalls in terms of some companies which have the reputation, credibility, and they know they don't just go by cost-benefit analysis. They are ready to do that, but not all the companies. So that's why probably regulation is required, but not stifling. We have to be very smart about it. That's what I think.
So just to add to whatever we were discussing, right? So we were discussing earlier that how Indian RAI development should be different, right? Build is one thing, but we have to also think of the adoption implementation, because as Doctor said that Indian companies they talk about it, but the implementation is next level, right? Adoption is next level. Whereas in the Europe, people are already humanitarian basis and they are already adopting. That's what is the view. So Indian build, adoption, and implementation should be very much aligned, right? And that has to be based on Indian context. There has to be incentive or some sort of motivation given so that this will really take the cause ahead. Right? So.
Thank you, folks. So we are running out of time, so I'd like to have at least 5-6 minutes for the audience questions. So, audience.
The second part of the panel discussion was really interesting on the regulations and the misuse of AI. And so one suggestion to the center would be to come up with like a benchmark to measure the intelligence of the software or a product or a process kind of stuff. The analogy was in the earlier days when we had the performance thing going on in the early 90s, when vendor A was saying, oh, I'm more faster than that vendor B. I can do, that many billion transaction TPS per second and all that stuff. And people making all kind of claims and stuff. Then we had the process of TPC benchmarking. Benchmarking was defined for DSS, OLTP, and so forth. And while defining the benchmark, we also defined the process of auditing a result, a benchmark. So I would like the Serai to think of a subject of auditing intelligence of data sets. And India is a place to start with, I think, because we proudly are not the owner of being the biggest populous country, there's so much data generated and consumed every day. I think that's the right place and for India to contribute on that subject.
Yeah, so I just want to plus one to that. I think that's really important because rather than waiting for this organic growth to happen, right? And in various organizations to while that will go on and take its own life, right? So if the center could play a role that I'm thinking in terms of say AI for IRB or IRB for AI kind of a thing, right? So where say it helps in bootstrapping implementation and evaluation of these kind of principles, so that they don't necessarily have to build up all of those things. I'm thinking about various organizations. They could come to the center, get benchmark and see where they stand. I think that'll be a tremendous value.
Yeah, certainly within the grander plan of the center that we are already looking at that. So when I was talking about the performance measure and that research theme, right? So one of the things that we are looking at is what it takes to certify an AI system, and what are the dimensions under which we should be certifying these, and so on and so forth. So that's something we'll certainly look at. And of course, building benchmark data sets and so on and so forth. Sure.
So like GDPR compliant, I can say CIRI compliant soon. No, you don't need to answer that.
Hi, just seeing this from a perspective of a legal professional, I think basically you mentioned there's a disconnect between the very high level. There are multiple toolkits for principles now for responsible AI, and applying those to your algorithm ultimately is going to be a challenge. One question, this is more of an observation than anything else, but I think it's very essential for regulation to happen of a certain kind, because in any disruptive technology which we have seen so far, the flow of regulation starts with zero, at least in India. Then there is a sort of, crisis event which occurs due to zero regulation, which puts everyone on political back foot, basically, resulting in automatic, maximum regulation, which is usually on the lines of banning, at least localize or delocalize. So for that particular reason, I think it's a good idea for industry to think of this meta policy regulation, because it's an intelligent way of understanding how to regulate without getting into the binaries. So the second thing is basically mapping the algorithms to principles. I think application-based is a very interesting way of looking at it, because then you can identify harms. But that's the question which I have, basically. In terms of harms, is there a way to classify the types of harms you're looking at? Because even music, right, or movies, you identify dark patterns straight away as one issue. But the other issue could very well be, with the kind of generative AI we have right now, people are identifying their IP coming out of the output itself. So what are the kinds of harms might be a good way of being able to identify what people should be looking like. The harm as the output would allow you to therefore regulate what needs to go in at the input stage, is what I'm saying. And do you have thoughts on that?
So there are some, again, it's going to be very application specific and domain specific, but there are some taxonomies of harm. So that have been kind of prepared. For example, at least in the Google setting, I know that those kind of organizations and identified those kind of harms are there. For example, there was this 2022 kind of update report on responsible AI, where some of those things are listed. So that's one source that I know. and probably there are there in other organizations as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I agree. Hi. Respective to generative AI, right? NASSCOM is coming out with a guidance on, how responsibly we should use generative AI. And in that, we have captured what are the harms, and we have taken 3 personas, right? One is the researcher, developer, and user, okay? And what are the obligations for them? So these are again just in high-level guardrails, but we have to go more detailed and have them build for each persona operation protocols, right? So that's coming out. It's in 0 draft. If I can share that with you, and yeah.
Thank you. The panelist on my left, he talked about the input and output of AI. So my concern is, at what point should responsible AI begin, from the input or from the output?
For me, I guess? Okay, right. Yeah, so I feel that it starts much before than input, right? I mean, ideally it should start at team formation itself, right? So the team that's kind of you're putting together needs to be as diverse as possible, so that they have ideally lived experiences of the harms and the discriminations that are likely to occur if you are not be careful enough, right? So right from team formation, even before you think about what needs to be done, what systems and what data sets, of course, that you're going to collect, all of those things you need to be careful about. And then of course, once you have built, decided on the algorithm, implemented that, once you have collected representative data sets, that in itself is not going to be a one-time process, right? So once you deploy that, you're going to find additional gaps that's there, and then you have to iteratively refine that, right? So to me, it kind of starts way upstream, even before, much before the input stage comes in.
Sorry, I'm just going to add to that. So I completely agree with what Partha said, right? So responsible AI is something that you first think about before you think of the AI solution. It's never, shouldn't be an afterthought, right? So you have to look at it from the entire pipeline. So.
Yeah, I think as both of them said, completely agreed. So you have to see the complete life cycle of the AI, right? Right from data collection, data storing, data lineage, and multiple phases. There are some 7 to 8 phases we have defined, and we have put what can be the mechanisms put or probably applied to each one of them. So I can share that link with you. So something called Responsible AI Hub. You can go and check, and there are this whole AI lifecycle with responsible AI interventions documented there. That will give you more clarity, but we can meet offline. I can give you that link.
A great discussion, folks. One observation and probably a comment. If you could draw a parallel between the Section 230 regulation in the US in terms of the communications decency and where the platform providers may not be responsible for the content that's being generated. That happened in the mid-90s, and that to a large extent paved way for the entire internet industry with companies like Google, Facebook, and all and whatnot. But then what we are now seeing as the repercussions of that, now the entire, the federal government is certainly looking for how to regulate these huge behemoths like Google or Facebook or companies that are using, to a large extent, if you look at AI that is being used in those platforms today in terms of how they are leaning towards decisions, like even we've kind of looked at election influences and stuff like that as well. So to a large extent, AI today seems to be irresponsible. So from that perspective, I would like to have your comments on that and see what, from a center's perspective, I think some level of regulation is certainly needed so that we don't land up in a similar kind of a soup years from now. Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying all of AI is irresponsible now. But you are right. I mean, it's been largely left to people to regulate it. So one of the things I always say is AI researchers never thought about this until a few years back, because we never thought people will actually use our systems, right? So now that it's actually out there and it's so all pervading, so yes, some amount of regulation is really needed. And the center will certainly be looking at putting out recommendations and guidelines, but not talking from the mountain, right? So we'd really like to talk to the stakeholders and figure out what are the kind of regulations that they need or that they are looking for and that's acceptable to them, and then start recommending things along those lines, as opposed to just putting them out. Nah, that's why you should remember that I was playing the role of the host on the panel, right? So most of the questions I asked are not really my opinions, just to get the things going. I mean, I agree with almost everything the panel said. So so we should get this going as soon as possible, not wait for 25 years or something like that. So we already started, like I said, this perception study in healthcare, and we should start doing this for other sectors as well, as quickly as possible. Anyone wants to add to that? Actually, in the interest of time, we will come to the panelists for a last, very quick 30-second summary. So I want to start with you, Gopi. Any closing thoughts, or we can just say pass?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
So it's a mischievous statement. You can interpret it any way you want. You are in for interesting times.
So I think we discussed a lot of good points. I think center like CRAI is built to take care of all the concerns we had, right? So all the best.
Yeah, I feel the center has big responsibility on its shoulders. So
we'll be a responsible center for responsible AI.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So I say all the best with everything.
Thank you, everyone.
We thank all the panel members. We just would like you to stay back for a second to receive a memento. Professor Ravi to hand over memento to all the panel members. Thank you. Thanks, Professor Ravi and all the panel members for the exciting panel discussion.